So, racism, KKK, white supremacy. One thing that got left out of there was also pollution from petrochemical companies. So there's so much to cover here. And this is, I really think we need to take a minute to thank Bruce Springsteen for this book, right?
Yeah. By the way, don't run out the door just because of the laundry list of like racism, pollution. Like there's some lightness to the book for those who haven't read it yet. But yeah, unexpectedly, this book would not have existed without Bruce Springsteen of all people. First of all, let me just interrupt myself. 2 quick points. One, thank you to the festival for bringing us out, and to Jill and all of the generosity you guys have shown. But also, this is a kind of historic thing for me personally, because out of hundreds of talks I've given, this is the very first one that my kids are in attendance. So I'm going to, so I don't know how long they'll put up with this, but thanks for coming, August and Izzy. So the Springsteen really, people always ask how I find my book ideas, and the truth is it just seems to be dumb luck. But about 4.5 years ago, my dad died from cancer that was spurred by Agent Orange, his exposure to Agent Orange during his deployment to Vietnam. And we'd been going back and forth between Los Angeles and Chicago, but the morning that he died, I was in LA, and I just felt uncomfortable sitting around the house as though it were a normal day. And I told my wife that I wanted to just go fishing that day. That's something that my dad taught me, and I thought it was a way of kind of communing with him. And so I threw my gear into the trunk of the car, and I drove up into the southern Sierra Nevadas. And I had the radio on, but I wasn't really paying attention to it, but until this song came on of Springsteen's called Galveston Bay, in which he sings about a young Vietnamese man who ended up on the Texas Gulf Coast and was trying to rebuild his life as a fisherman, as a shrimper. And before he knew it, he was sort of in the crosshairs of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas. And I didn't think that it was based on anything true. It just struck me as a very sort of concocted premise for a song. But it kept kind of nagging at me over the coming weeks and months, and then I finally just went on Google and started researching that it was based on a kind of shocking and true series of events. And then there was this sort of turn of events where I just felt like, well, somebody must have written a great book about it. There was no book. Then this is the way my Scandinavian mind processes things, when I was like, well, everyone's probably already dead. They won't be able to talk to me. But then I started reaching out and finding these people, and before I knew it, I was, convincing my wife. Our kids were only 2 years old and a year old at that point, that I needed to start going down to Texas to start spending time with, old Klansmen and others. And so that was what resulted was a several year-long investigation into the story that we'll get into today.
Yeah. So you start the book with Billy Joe Alpin. So let's start there. He's one of the white fishermen. Tell us a little bit about Billy Joe.
So Billy Joe was a kind of down on his luck shrimper. He had lost his shrimp boat. It snagged on something and sank to the bottom of one of these bays. So he was sort of knocked down to crabbing. He had 3 young children and was sort of barely scraping by. He was not a Texan originally. He moved there from Florida. But one day he is pulling up his traps and he finds some mutated crabs inside the traps. And he looks up at the coastline, and if anyone has been to the Texas Gulf Coast, this is the heart of the petrochemical industry in America. For the last 70 or 80 years, there has been this steady expansion of massive chemical plants that get permission from the state to impound the fresh water that used to feed these bays. That fresh water is then run through all of these kind of nasty processes to create all of the chemicals that are the building blocks of every consumer product that we use now. And then the toxic water gets permits to be dumped into the bays. And so in Nantucket, I'm sure you're all aware, but these are very fragile ecosystems, and especially with crustaceans, it all depends on like the salinity level and the what else is in the water. And so he starts pulling up these mutated specimens in his trap, and the traps are coming up lighter every year, and he starts suspecting, this is in the late 70s, he starts suspecting that the plants might be behind it. And so he tries to rally his fellow fishermen to take on the plants. But it goes nowhere, because these guys, all the fishermen, work at the chemical plants in the off season, and so they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. So generally, he's just a pissed off guy. He doesn't really see much hope for the future. And then one morning, he's out running his traps with his family, and he sees a young Vietnamese kid, 18 years old, who has just dropped his crab traps too close to Billy Joe's. And there are all these sort of unwritten rules of crabbing and shrimping. They're called unwritten. They're not enshrined anywhere, and there are no firm laws about it. But to Billy Joe, this was sort of the last straw. And so he just snapped. He pulled up all the Vietnamese kids' traps, and he smashes them, throws them back into the bay. And then for the next month, every time he sees this young Vietnamese man, because they had a confrontation in the ensuing moments. But every time he sees this young Vietnamese man in town, he tells him he's going to kill him. He stabs the tires of his car and slashes the tires. He raised a rifle at him at one point and threatened him there. And so the young Vietnamese man named Sao Van Nguyen went and bought himself a pistol at Walmart. And the tension keeps climbing, and the Vietnamese, I should say, they were there because there was a crab picking plant that had just been opened in town, and they could not find any white people that were willing to pick the crabs. The crab picking is such a brutal job that at one point up the coastline in Louisiana, there was a big plant that they were trying to find staffers to do the work. They couldn't find any white people. They then turned to prisoners. And they told prisoners, we'll give you a choice. You can spend the day or the week crabbing, plucking the crab meat out, or you can sit in your jail cell. And after a week, all the prisoners opted to just stay in prison. It's that brutal, the work. And so the only workforce that these companies could find were Vietnamese refugees who had been resettled after the fall of Saigon. So there is this clash. These are very small towns. I was just there a few weeks ago, but 700-800 people, and then overnight, not overnight technically, but like over the course of a few months, a couple hundred Vietnamese refugees are in town. And so the tensions were bubbling and bubbling, and then this little conflagration between Billy Joe and Sao turned into kind of a match that ignited the whole coast.
Yeah. And so we have these tensions, and the Vietnamese refugees come in. They buy boats from the white fishermen that are, not in the greatest shape. They mark them way up, the price. They really were taking advantage of these refugees. And then the refugees go out and they're successful. They work together, and this kind of pissed off the white fishermen even more.
Yes. And this was, honestly, one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was that, I think what you see here is a way of life of shrimping and crabbing the bays of the Gulf Coast that was basically doomed. And there was one of the last sort of spasms of life for it was when the Vietnamese came in, and many of them had been fishermen back home before they were turned into refugees. The whites really did just play them for suckers, and they sold them boats that the minute you pulled them out of the water, the hull would fall out, the engines would explode, and all of this. But the Vietnamese did everything that you could ask, because they would not go on welfare. They didn't hire outside deckhands. They used family members. I talked to one guy who's now in his 50s, but when he came over after the fall of Saigon, there was a choice. They had to figure out how to make ends meet, and so he was desperate to go to college, but he stopped going to school so that he could help his dad work the boat so that his younger siblings could go to school. And he told me, I sacrificed my future for my siblings. Now, we were just talking about my brothers. I'm the youngest of 3 boys. They are my best friends. I talk to them every day. Anything good or bad news, like we all talked through it together. I would not sacrifice my future for my brothers. I love them. I don't think they would for me. So there is a kind of advantage in some ways that was born out of desperation that the Vietnamese had. They had nothing. They put everything they could into shrimping and crabbing, and as a result, after a few years, they became such an effective economic force. They were so good at this that the whites freaked out.
Yeah.
And they ran to the governor of Texas, who was then advised by a young Karl Rove, who I spent a lot of time speaking with unexpectedly, and they begged the governor for a ban on refugees. And when the governor said, sorry, they have every right to be here, they've been admitted into our country, they then turned to the Ku Klux Klan, and they brought the Klan into the fight. And just to close one loophole on Billy Joe, but so basically one night Billy Joe confronted that young man Sal down by the docks, cut his chest open with a knife, and Sal pulled his pistol out and shot and killed him. And everybody expected a quick death sentence, sort of Texas justice, but a pretty miraculous turn of events. But he found one of the best lawyers in the country who represented him. He was acquitted by an all-white jury in a very conservative part of the state on grounds of lawful self-defense. And so what many of us might see as a kind of affirmation of the workings of the justice system, down there, they saw it as a sinister plot, that there must have been evidence that was hidden, or that if they weren't going to get justice this way, they were going to get it some way else. And so when the governor wouldn't ban refugees, that's when, in the wake of Billy Joe's killing, that they then brought the Klan in.
Yeah. And then we have Colonel Nam, who plays a big role here. Tell us a little bit about him. He's the one all the Vietnamese refugees turn to because of his reputation in Vietnam.
Yes. So one thing that you have to understand, these weren't idle threats. The night that Billy Joe was killed, a posse was mobilized. It took me years to figure out who was in it and to get confessions, but I did. And they roamed through town with Molotov cocktails, firebombing Vietnamese homes and boats, and they torched these boats down to the waterline. Vietnamese were given death threats right and left, and then when the Klan entered, there were these massive rallies. This was national news. Cronkite was covering it. They were given 90 days to get off the coast or else face blood. Now, many of these Vietnamese were pretty seasoned warriors at this point, but they didn't want to fight. But at the same time, they didn't really want to flee either, but many of them were getting ready to sell their boats and to get out of there, until this very charismatic colonel named Nam Van Nguyen shows up in Galveston Bay. He's had 22 years of combat experience. He commanded thousands of men before South Vietnam fell. And he forms the Vietnamese Fishermen's Coalition, and he basically organizes the Vietnamese, and he says, trust me, we're not gonna flee, we're gonna fight back, but we're not gonna use weapons, we're gonna put our faith in this document, in the United States Constitution. You gotta trust me on this. If they harass us, you just gotta turn the other cheek, but we're gonna put our faith in the courts. And it's a really remarkable turn of events, what happened.
Yeah, so we have Morris Dees, enter Morris Dees, and they file a suit.
That's right. So there was a kind of great sequence of events, but the Klan, they were operating without any real fear here. I mean, they marauded through Galveston Bay in Klan boat patrols, where there were shrimp boats with a dozen armed and robed Klansmen. They would hang an effigy of a Vietnamese refugee from the outriggers. And they went around raising rifles and in some cases shooting over the bows of Vietnamese boats. And that morning, there was a photojournalist who just happened to be off work, but he took a picture of one of these Klan boat patrols. It made the front page of the New York Times. And over in Montgomery, Alabama, Morris Dees, who was the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, opens his morning paper, sees this hops on his motorcycle and rides down the coast and basically heads out in search of Colonel Nam and convinces Nam to let him and the Southern Poverty Law Center represent the Vietnamese. And so, yeah, they filed suit. They filed for an emergency injunction from the federal government that would basically say, back off, Klan, the Vietnamese have every right to be here. And also, and the other half of the suit was to basically break apart the Klan's militia, which was a very well-trained militia that was operating all along the coastline. And so the middle portion of the book basically is a courtroom thriller. I mean, the Klan they were stalking the lawyers' homes. They were trailing lawyers in cars. The lawyers were climbing under their cars to inspect the chassis, looking for bombs. Morris and his team started wearing body armor. It was the first time that metal detectors were installed in the federal courthouse in Houston. And all of this was to defend, or to at least ascertain whether or not the Vietnamese would have the right to be there. And so much sort of hanged in the balance because the Klan was getting so much press attention that every time they threatened the Vietnamese, national news would cover it, and then there would be this flood of new members who would pay dues, and they could open up new chapters. And so this really was a kind of, you could see history kind of in the balance, forking one way or another.
And they were so brazen, like on the boat. They weren't wearing their masks. I mean, you knew who they were, and there was nobody keeping the Klan in check by any stretch of the imagination. So, surprisingly, they win this suit. And talk about the importance of that. What might have happened had they not won?
Well, so basically the federal judge, she was the first female African-American judge ever appointed to the bench in Texas. And she herself, I managed to get it through FOIA, but she was getting horrific death threats throughout from white supremacists around the country. But what happened was she not only ordered the Klan, they weren't even allowed to come within, eyesight of any Vietnamese anymore, or else they'd be facing U.S. Marshals. But she also ordered the militia to be broken apart. The head of the Klan, who was a fearsome man named Louis Beam, a highly decorated Vietnam War vet himself, Louis Beam has the kind of dark, I don't know how to put it, but a long shadow over the modern era, because he basically, as a result of this court action, concluded that the way to really advance the white supremacist agenda was not through having big rallies that might be infiltrated by the feds, that what we should do is just start operating in tiny cells or even as lone wolves. And he wrote this paper, he wrote a book called Essays of a Klansman, but one paper called Leaderless Resistance, which every white supremacist today has read. This Louis Beam is an icon, and he's basically credited, he's an icon to the far right, he's basically credited with popularizing the lone wolf attacks. And so they just sentenced the synagogue, the Tree of Life shooter a couple days ago, and he had talked about Louis Beam's writings. They think that McVeigh might have been inspired by Louis Beam with the Oklahoma City attack. So, but what I came to realize was that if the Vietnamese had not stood their ground here, then the Klan would have been emboldened to do this against any refugee group in any industry in any part of the country that they didn't like. They viewed this as a sort of trial run. And as a result, and I don't want to suggest that it stamped out white supremacist, thought in America or anything, but as a result, it basically shattered their militia, and it sent most of the leaders of the Texas Klan on the run and into hiding. And now the Vietnamese have basically went on to dominate Gulf shrimping in Texas until now there's not that much shrimp left there. Yeah. I feel like I'm really depressing you all. I'm sorry.
No. Well, now we're going to talk about another hero in the book, and that's Diane Wilson. And Diane, like Billy Joe, started seeing these deformities of shrimp and crabs, and so nobody would listen to her either, right? So she's out collecting these things, and then these things called nurdles become the real evidence. So Tesla, and she first starts out, she doesn't have any power. She doesn't know any politicians. She's not an activist. She's just a fisherman, right?
She's a fisherwoman, and she was a fourth generation shrimper. I just saw her a few weeks ago. She's just, I don't know how to say other than just she's a spitfire, and she had this kind of mystical connection to the water where she really felt like she needed to protect it. And so she was from the same town that all this was boiling over. She knew all of the Applins and Billy Joe, but she watched all of her fellow male fishermen. She was the sole female shrimper on that coast. She watched all of the men in her community basically lose their minds over the Vietnamese. And she kept saying, stop paying attention to these refugees and pay attention to these plants. It's obviously the petrochemical industry that's doing it. And it wasn't until, it was actually in 1989, she opens her newspaper and sees the first ever toxic release inventory, which was ordered by the federal government for companies to start self-reporting. And she discovers that her county, Calhoun County, Texas, which has only about 10,000 residents, is the most polluted county in America, by water, by air, and by land. To this day, along the Gulf Coast, they have 170 times the cancer rate, the rest of the country. It got to the point where I could tell who worked at which plant by what kind of cancer they had. These are called sacrifice zones in America, where there are no colleges along that coastline. There are people that barely have high school educations, and the only jobs they have are to this grueling shrimping work where you can't make a living, or to work in a plant that is going to expose you to chemicals that will kill you off, basically. And so Diane saw this. She's got 5 young children, and she's like, well, I'm going to do something about it. She wasn't an activist. She didn't know what to do. She was just angry. And so she started speaking out, and she's now, this was I would not have written this book were it not for Diane Wilson, because she really is, as bleak as all of this subject matter is, she is, if we don't have more people like Diane Wilson, we are lost as a country, because she went on this battle for decades. It ended up breaking up her marriage. Her home had been shot at. Her pets had been killed. Her children were ostracized from the community. Her boat was sabotaged twice, all because she dared to take on these plants. And she lost nearly everything until one morning she got a tip from someone who worked at one of these plants and said, "You look up this stuff in the seabeds. They're called nurdles, and nurdles are like these tiny little plastic pellets, which are used to basically build and melted into every plastic toy and everything that we're, probably this cap here." And so she starts collecting and organizing this citizen collective to go out every weekend and go outside these plants with methodical scientific rigor and start gathering these little pellets from the seabed. And they mark the day that they caught them and the location and all of that. And she eventually, after about a decade, she's got 30 million of these things. And she files suit against Formosa, a massive multinational company that had a plant there. And she made history two or 3 years ago as winning the largest ever settlement in U.S. history under the Clean Water Act. And she now basically represents the last best hope, where if there's any hope to revive this industry, building new fish houses, cleaning the water up, it's all down to this 75-year-old woman who, even though the settlement she just won is tens of millions of dollars, I mean, she lives on her $425 a month Social Security stipend. But she's a truly, profoundly remarkable woman.
You can't help but love her. She starts this and she wants to have a meeting, to get everybody in town. She wants to talk about, this is when she's first beginning, and she makes a sheet cake. Yeah,
she knew shrimpers like sheet cake, and she kept telling me that they kept coming out too flat, and she's like, well, I promised them sheet cake, but she organized this meeting before she even knew what she wanted. She had this habit of listening to her heart, and when her heart was telling her to do something, she would act before her brain could talk her out of it. And that she just kept doing step by step and believing in the justness of her cause. And she's I mean, she has been, I think, jailed or imprisoned something like 2 or 3 dozen times. She was just imprisoned again, or jailed again, a few months ago because she's trying to keep one of the bays there from being dredged up because for deeper ships to come in. Because if you dredge it up, there's a Superfund site at the bottom with mercury. And so, I mean, there's a part that this will all might seem kind of obscure or localized to Texas, but really at the heart, this is a story about how much are we willing to trade of what we have now in exchange for some short-term jobs that might pay some money, but at the long-term cost of the destruction of our environment or our ecosystems or all of that. But that at the same time, and this is where I think Diane plays such an important role, what I saw was, as you said, this way of life of like, these guys basically were set upon from all sides. The plants were dumping all this stuff into the bays. Free trade agreements made it cheaper for Americans to eat farm-raised shrimp that are raised, ironically, in Vietnam or Thailand. So if you go to, I don't know if there's probably not Trader Joe's in Nantucket, but if you go to the grocery store and you look at where that shrimp is from, that's in the packaged shrimp, it's been raised on a farm in Indonesia or Thailand. It's not caught from the Gulf of Mexico. And so there were all these things that were basically driving out this way of life, but the white fishermen, they looked around and they saw about 100 other-looking people. People with darker skin color than them. And they said, they're the problem. Let's get rid of them and everything will be great again. And they debased themselves, their names, and their community, and they got chewed up in court, basically. And in the end, what happened was, even though they tried to take the Vietnamese out, nothing mattered, because at this point now, there is hardly any bay shrimping left in Texas. It's gone. Those bays are dead for shrimp. And so there's a really kind of, to me, it felt like it was screaming to the current moment that I feel like there's so many times that we have people who are telling us that the problem is not the people above you, the people below you. And if we just kick them around, everything's going to be okay again. We just need to get rid of these tiny people that don't have any agency themselves. And Diane was sort of the one person in this story who could turn the spotlight from the fishermen on the bays to the plants, and she did it very fearlessly and successfully.
And the Vietnamese fishermen really helped her cause, because nobody would listen to her. The other fishermen, they didn't want to take on this fight because of their family members working at the plant. What will happen to our jobs? Her own family, her sister, they all turned their back on her, and she went to the Vietnamese fishermen, and they were the one that helped her get her message out.
That's right. And in one very dramatic moment near the end of the book, but she kept having one defeat after another, and no one was joining her side. And she was sort of driven to despair, and her last effort was she was just going to sink her shrimp boat in front of the plant in a sort of a symbolic act. This was post 9/11, and so that action of obstructing a federal waterway was now considered an act of terrorism. And so just before she was able to do it, the Coast Guard found her, they boarded her boat, and they dragged her, they towed her boat. She had already taken the engine out. She was getting towed there. But they imprisoned her in her boat that night until they figured out where they were going to transfer her to. And she was looking at something like 10 or 15 years in prison for this symbolic act. And the next morning at 5 or 6 a.m., she hears this kind of crude horn from one of the trawlers coming by, and there was an armada of Vietnamese and white shrimpers who had basically come in solidarity to her rescue, and they blockaded the whole bay. And they wouldn't let all of these heavy tanker ships get out. And so the feds were pushed into this terrible bind, like, what are we going to do here? Like, we're losing money by not getting these ships out. And so they basically just let her go. But it was the first moment where the whites and the Vietnamese started coming together to basically save Diane. So, I mean, I really I have to always shut myself up, because she really is such an inspiration. And I mean, this book would not be here were it not for her.
And also Colonel Nam is also a hero in the book. I mean, the Vietnamese, he really rallied them, and there could have been more violence had he not really had that message of let's be peaceful here. We'll win this in the end.
Yes. Yeah. The restraint that this community showed, and this is the thing that I always feel. The first time I came to Nantucket, I came to the film festival because there was a documentary about. I had spent almost 10 years of my life fighting the U.S. government to get refugees from Iraq out, because I was in Iraq during the war, and many of these were friends of mine that had been killed. And I still feel this need to explain, especially in the post-Trump era, something very obvious here, that as wonderful as this country is, nobody wants to become a refugee. These Vietnamese would have given anything to be back home, to be able to visit their ancestors at the cemetery, to be able to raise their kids in the communities that they grew up in. So, with all love to the Texas Gulf Coast, the Vietnamese, none of them were growing up dreaming of living in Rockport or Corpus Christi or these places. And so when you imagine washing ashore in our country after decades of warfare, and they finally find a little moment of peace, a little toehold. They're working their tails off to try to find some future for their children. And then the Klan comes in. As authors, we're supposed to, disclaim that we don't have any biases, but it's silly. Of course, I have a very clear bias here. This isn't a both sides thing. I was very squarely on the side of the Vietnamese here. I still spent way more time than I ever wanted to with Klansmen and some of the whites that set fire to the boats, but that was partly just, my bloodhound side, because the FBI spent 5 years trying to solve these crimes and they never did. And now all the statutes of limitations have passed on arson and everything, but I got more confessions than I ever imagined for this. But
how about questions from the audience? Somebody, yeah, right over here. Hang on, we're gonna have a mic come to you.
One of my kids is asleep. So August, you're doing great, pal.
There actually was a film made about this, but it did not show any of the Klan involvement. That's new to me. It was a film called Alamo Bay in 1985 that starred Ed Harris. So I was completely unaware that the Klan was involved in this whole fight. And could you tell people a little bit more about the area? Because you're really talking about from Corpus all the way up to Galveston Bay, right?
Yeah. These towns are, they're on the coastline, but to me they always felt almost like island communities, where you could drive for an hour outside of a town of 700 or 800 people, and you won't see anything but rolling farmland or these massive plants. They are economically devastated now. I was just in Seadrift, where the bulk of this book takes place, and there is one cafe, one diner on all of Main Street. The rest is all plywood at this point. 100 years ago, they were sort of in their glory days, but it's just they've been battered by hurricane after hurricane, and then the steady sort of metastasis of these chemical plants. And so, yes, there was that movie. It was a Louis Malle film of Alamo Bay. But I think there was a kind of, Billy Joe, who I mentioned, for example, nobody knew that he himself was in the Ku Klux Klan until I discovered that, and it took years of snail mail letters and writing to his widow and to one of his children before I was able to fly down and get it on the record that they had joined, which explains why the Klan initially got involved. But then the minute that this all kind of subsided, and especially after the court ruling, I think there were plenty in the state that were quite happy to just memory hole it and to just be like, what are you talking about, Klan? Like, no, we don't really have a problem with that. There's just some outliers. But I mean, I've seen footage from these Klan rallies where like the mayors of these small towns would be like posing next to Klansmen, and it was all just kind of good fun for them. And to this day, there were so many of them that say, well, this wasn't really about racism. It was just about economics. We're just trying to defend our piece of the American pie. To which I would sort of politely I would start politely at least, but to just say that you can't be chanting white power in Klan robes and then try to say, well, it's not really about racism. You're misconstruing us. So I think it's a legacy that they're embarrassed by, and so they, put it this way, like there aren't many people in Texas that are like excited about the book being out, but it felt like it was necessary to get it down,
Another question?
I think
Right down
Mary.
here I'll go there and then we'll go here.
There is a core of integrity that binds all of the work that you do, a real moral center at its hold. Where does that come from?
Thank you. That's kind. I come from a family of public servants. My dad was a politician, which now is sort of a slur, but back then, it wasn't. So I grew up watching people from the community come to our front porch, and my dad would be sitting on his rocking chair with a legal pad, and he would be writing down what their problems were. And then as a little boy, I would go down to Springfield, Illinois, and watch him introduce it into law. And it was a very kind of, now seems like a loss to the, mists of memory. But the story that I always say to illustrate my dad. So there was one summer when I was in high school where something terrible had happened. Some guy tried to kill his dog in a very inhumane way. And so my dad passed a bill that basically banned cruelty to your pet. And I went to all of these, my dad was a Republican. I went to all of these, animal rights organizations where they were celebrating my dad and giving him plaques and things. And then 2 months later, there was this huge proliferation of Canada geese in Illinois. They were everywhere. They were destroying the golf courses, and the retirement homes were overwhelmed. And so my dad was like, well, I'm just going to listen to my constituents. So he introduced legislation to allow killing Canada geese by bow and arrow. Then there was the strangest turn of events, but in southern Illinois, this Canada goose starts flying overhead. It came from some other state, and there was an arrow through it. And so they started calling it was alive, but they started calling it the Johnson goose. And so, which is my last name. And so every day I was driving to high school, and I'd tune into local NPR, and they'd be like, Johnson goose sighted just north of Peoria or whatever. And all the animal rights groups asked for their plaques back and things like that. But to me, it was this illustration of you don't just try to surf the waves of popularity. You have to find some kind of grounding principle. And so on this particular note on refugees, when I was 8 years old, we opened our doors to 8 Ukrainian Jewish refugees who had fled during the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I grew up teaching Ukrainian kids English. My grandmother next door hosted 20 Hmong refugees while we were growing up. And, there were always these examples that I had where, even on topics as loaded as the abortion debate in America, my grandmother, who lived next door, she was an ardent anti-abortion activist, but she did not write checks. What she did was she opened her home up to pregnant women whose families had kicked them out, or whose boyfriends had ditched them. And my grandmother had some means. And so over the course of my childhood, there were 55 pregnant women that lived next door. I used to think that in order to become a babysitter, you had to be pregnant. And so I'm pro-choice, but at my grandmother's funeral, there were 55 kids that came up onto that stage. And so the point of bringing up that story is that even on these fraught issues, these political issues, I was raised to believe that the forming your opinion is the easiest thing to do. It's what you do with that opinion that separates people. And so really, for me, I was 20 when 9/11 happened. I was a Middle Eastern Studies major, and I spoke Arabic. And I was in Egypt when the war in Iraq started. And I was opposed to that war, profoundly opposed to it. But coming from the family that I came from, I was like, well, I have to do something. And I kept reading that our government did not have anyone that knew the language or understood the region. And so I went over to Iraq to help coordinate the reconstruction efforts. And then that's what sort of set me on this long path of trying to help my Iraqi colleagues out. But if there is a through line, it really is this really simple lesson from my parents where, I mean, at dinner, my dad would, before we would start, he would go around the table and he would say, well, what did you do for your community today? And I remember just kind of shrinking because I'd be like, oh, I hate this part of dinner, you know, and like trying. But for whatever reason, it feels like something took hold, you know. Anyways, I don't want to puff myself up.
Last question right here.
Back to Diane.
Mm-hmm.
So she was ostracized by the community, but she had her cousin who she kind of confided in.
Mm-hmm.
How devastated was she to find out that he was working for the chemical company?
Yeah, so for those who haven't read it, Diane, while she was sort of in the belly of the whale, she kept confiding in her cousin, who seemed to be one of the only friends that she could trust. And she would say, well, I'm thinking of doing this, I'm thinking of doing that. And so, you know, when I mentioned that the Coast Guard was there to intercept her from scuttling her boat, it turns out that her cousin had been on the payroll for like 15 years from the petrochemical industry just to spy on her and to report things. And so when I asked her that very question, she laughed. She said, well, I mean, he was broke. I'm glad he made some money off of it. And when she won her settlement against Formosa, the cousin apparently then went to the next largest petrochemical plant and offered his services to them. So there's a kind of, I don't know, battle-won wisdom that she has, that she's incredibly, like, just keeps knocking the dust off and moving forward. By the way, I know we're out of time. I just want to thank you all for coming today. This means a lot. There's a lot of dark moments when you're writing a book like this. And also, I mean, my wife was just doing a last second haircut before I came over, and she's like, you're going gray. And I realized that since I was last here 4 years ago, like something majorly stressful must have happened to the planet that have caused us all to age a bit. But I will say that, like, I mean, this book, this entire book was written between 8 p.m. as soon as our kids went to sleep and 5 a.m. And so every single morning, like, I would crash into bed and my wife, who's here, would handle the kids. And so this is like a very meaningful, I don't know, coda to be able to come and talk about it with you all. Despite what is, I know it's not the happiest, escapist subject, but
It's an important story.
yeah, hopefully it's not like a, you know, eat your spinach type of book for those who haven't read it.
Not at all. Not at all. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Kirk. Thanks. Thank you.